Thank you, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here. As I drove up this incredibly beautiful valley last night, I remembered that Sandra Day O'Connor actually has been here in this valley. Her family, the Day family, lived here in the 19th century, and she went poking around in these hills looking for tombstones, and also attended the Stratton Golf Academy for a couple of years. When Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1981, it was a huge big deal. It was the largest bunch of press passes ever requested for a congressional hearing, more than Watergate. It was the first time a congressional hearing, a confirmation hearing for a Supreme Court justice had ever been televised. She was the first woman. It had been 200 years since there had been a woman. She was confirmed 99-0. Imagine that today. But when she got on the court, what was it like for her? Well, for her, the court was cold. It was literally cold. It was made out of marble, not Vermont marble, I'm sorry to say, Indiana marble. But it was a cold place. And when she went to her first lunch of the other justices, only 4 of them showed up. Half of them didn't show up. They weren't all that glad to see her. They talked amongst themselves. How should we welcome her? One of the problems was that the junior justice, the duties of the newest justice on the court, were to do 2 things: take notes and get coffee. I thought maybe get coffee, maybe not. But Justice Stevens told us that they would ask her to get coffee, but they didn't. Before her first conference, there's a wonderful tradition on the court of each justice shakes the hand of every other justice. And Whizzer White, Justice Byron White, who had been an all-pro halfback, it was a fairly tough guy, shook her hand and crushed it, so that she went into her first Supreme Court conference, the first woman ever crying. She had tears, she put it squirting from her eyes. Her first oral argument, she knew everybody was waiting for her to ask a question. The press was out there waiting for her to ask a question. And she finally, after a half an hour, did, and the idiot lawyer in front of her talked over her. And she wrote in her diary that night, "I feel put down." Now, the thing about her was that she very rarely felt put down or for long. Within a couple of months, Justice Powell was writing that to his family, that Sandra Day O'Connor was brilliant. She had to deal with it. She had to deal with the men she was acquainted with as best she could. The Chief Justice Berger, at her investiture, he paraded her down the steps of the Supreme Court and said to the reporters, "You've never seen me with a better looking justice." She smiled. She just dealt with it. And before long, she was telling her husband, we had Osi and I, my wife Osi, who's sitting here with me, worked very closely on this book with me for a long time. We had a lot of access. We had access to all her papers, including her husband's diary. And she wrote, her husband wrote, that she said to him that after a couple of years she felt like she was in the catbird seat. And she was. She was, the idea of the swing vote. She was the 5th vote 330 times in 25 years. That's a lot of power. And the reporters began referring to it as the O'Connor Court. She grew up on a ranch in the southeast corner of Arizona, remote, beautiful, 160,000 acres. It took a man on a horse a full day to ride across it. She said it was like our own country. And her father, Mr. Day, ran some cowboys and 2,000 head of cattle. No running, when she was first born, no running water, no electricity, very primitive. Her playmates were other cowboys. And she learned some important lessons in self-reliance from her father. She liked to tell this story to her law clerks, that when she was 15, her job was to get up in the morning and make lunch for the roundup. And the roundup is miles away. So she gets up at 5 a.m., she cooks the roast, she cooks the cake, she loads the truck, and she has a flat tire. And she's a slight girl, and she has to jump on the jack to change the tire. It takes her an hour. She's late, and she gets to the roundup, and her father looks at her and says, "You're late." She said, "Well, Dad, I had to change a tire." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." This was an important lesson to her, and she would repeat this story to her clerks. The message was clear: no excuses. She never made excuses. So her father had a big influence on her, but actually I think her mother was a greater force in her life in a more subtle way. Her mother was a very elegant woman. Even though she's out on this dusty ranch, she always wore dresses, she always wore hose, nice shoes, she subscribed to Vogue, and at night, Mr. Day could have a drink or two and be a bit of a bully. And Sandra watched as her mother dealt with her father, not by being submissive, not by being cowed, but also not by getting into stupid fights, not by picking fights, knowing when to stand up to him and when to walk away, when not to take the bait. This is a very important lesson for a woman who spent her lifetime dealing with obnoxious males. She went to Stanford, her father's greatest wish, at the age of 16. She was this girl off of a ranch, but at her first night she went to a mixer there called the Jolly Up, and this didn't happen in 1946, but she did. She went up and she asked the guy to dance. His name was Andy Campbell. O.C. and I met him many years later. He was still in love with her. She was pretty and vivacious young woman, but as Andy Campbell said, she didn't love me, she loved a course called Western Civilization. Western Civ, which is a course they no longer teach at Stanford because it's considered to be too patriarchal and hegemonic and all that, but for her, it was an incredible eye-opener. And we read her final exam, written when she was 17 years old. It is a brilliant exegesis on the founders, on Madison and Jefferson, and on the rule of law, and it informed her and filled her with not only a knowledge, but a desire to do something for the rule of law. She made that her life. She also had a big social life. As far as we could tell, she was proposed to 4 times, maybe more, engaged 2 times that we know of, and she was a very forward girl. In fact, she wanted to be efficient, and so that in the parking lot of the law school, she got a bucket of paint and she painted her own reserved parking space. But this was 1950, and it was still a man's world, and the man asked. And she had an interesting relationship. We discovered this relationship because we had access to her papers, and Elsie and I were really curious. We were looking at her papers in the Library of Congress, and there were no love letters. And we knew that she had a great marriage, that her marriage to John O'Connor was a great marriage, but we couldn't find any love letters. But then back in her chambers in the Supreme Court, her longtime secretary took us down to a storage locker, and we found down there a box marked correspondence. And we said, "Can we see it?" And the family said yes. And we went through there, and there were a lot of love letters between John O'Connor and Sandra Day. There were also 14 love letters between William Rehnquist and Sandra Day. William Rehnquist, later the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The 7th love letter said, "Sandy, will you marry me?" He asked her to marry. They never told anybody, never told their own families, never told any of the other justices. It was known that they had gone out together and maybe gone to a couple of movies, but not that that he had asked her to marry. Now, it's a nice story. This is 1952. It's before sex. So they were able to have a good friendship thereafter for many years on the court, and remained close friends. In fact, we have a picture in our book. When he died, we have a photograph of her weeping. And she's not just weeping, she is completely undone at the loss of her dear, dear friend. There was a little bit of teasing on the court. Justice Harry Blackmun sat next to Justice Rehnquist on the court, and when Sandra Day O'Connor came on the court, Blackman leaned over to Rehnquist and he said, "Now, no fooling around." While she was being courted, she was trying to find a job. Now, at Stanford Law School in those days, if you had a B average, you could apply to a law firm that posted its address up on the bulletin board, and she applied to 40 law firms. Sandra Day was order of the coif, top 10% of her class. She was on law review, clearly one of the smartest students in her class. Only one law firm gave her an interview. That law firm was Gibson, Day & Crutcher in Los Angeles. They asked her, "How well do you type?" They wanted to talk to her about a secretarial job. Flash forward 30 years later. The Attorney General of the United States is a former Gibson Dunn partner named William French Smith. He is calling Sandra Day O'Connor, Judge Sandra Day O'Connor, to ask her to come to Washington to interview the President of the United States for a job on the U.S. Supreme Court. She comes on the phone and says to him, "You wouldn't be calling me about secretarial work, would you?" She liked to tell that story. It was a fun story. But the interesting thing to me about it was that she was never bitter about really anything. And even although it was outrageous that she couldn't find a job, she didn't complain. She couldn't make it in the private sector, so she went to the public sector. She went to the local DA, the local district attorney, and she said, "I want to work for you." And he said, "I don't have any money, I can't hire you." She said, "I'll work for free." And he said, "I have no space for you." She said, "I'll work off of your secretary's desk." And she did. And ultimately, he hired her. She went off to Germany with her husband, she was married John O'Connor. They went to interestingly, one reason why she did string Justice Rehnquist along for a long time, because Justice O'Connor took a while to ask her to marry him, but he did. They went to Germany together. She comes back to Phoenix to start their life. He gets a job at the fancy law firm, even though his grades were lower than hers. She ends up hanging a shingle in a low-rent shopping mall, taking any case that will walk on the door. But again, never bitter about it. She goes into public life again. She becomes a state legislator. And amazingly, she's elected the majority leader of the Arizona State Senate, first woman ever to be elected the majority leader of a state senate. And while she was there, it's interesting, she had a lot of power, but she used it carefully. And the story that fascinates me is that you remember that it's still around actually, the Equal Rights Amendment. Interestingly, 1968, 69, 1970, it was almost non-controversial. It was on the Republican platform and the Democratic platform. But by the early 70s, along came Phyllis Schlafly. Remember Phyllis Schlafly? And the moral majority is getting going, and there's a backlash against women's lib. And so the ERA, which has passed Congress, now is out in the states to be ratified. All of a sudden, it's run into this conservative opposition. Sandra Day O'Connor, as majority leader, introduced the ERA in the Arizona legislature, and then she let it die in committee. And the activists were furious at her for betraying them. And they rumored that she was just trying to get Barry Goldwater to give her a judgeship, and she took a lot of grief, which she never complained about, never complained, never explained. Instead, what she did, she quietly used her power to amend every single law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women. There were dozens of them. Women couldn't get a credit card. There were all sorts of property issues. They couldn't work more than 8 hours a day. She changed every single one of those laws. Osi and I found a handwritten list that she had done of all the laws she wanted to change. Typical of her. Why didn't she push the ERA? Because she knew it would fail. She didn't have the votes. So instead of breaking her pick and making a big moral show of standing up for the ERA and fighting a battle she could not win, she fought a battle she could win and changed the laws in the state one by one. She had great people skills. And there were some pretty difficult people in the Arizona legislature. Her chief nemesis was a fellow named Tom Goodwin, who was he was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, so she couldn't get the budget passed without going through him. The problem with Goodwin was that he was a drunk, a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk, a real drunk. And she finally called him on it. And he looked at her and said, "If you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose." And she looked back at him and said, "If you were a man, you could." Now, I like to tell that story, but it's actually a one-off. She did not go around defying men, and she was much more typical of her that she would walk away from a fight. She didn't waste her shots. When she had to, as she had to with Tom Goodwin, she would stand up to him. But a lot of the time, she would just, finesse it, walk away, not take the bait. She had great skills in dealing, and this was extremely useful on the U.S. Supreme Court, because those justices, they're appointed for life, but they don't necessarily like each other or even get along with each other. And she had to deal with one in particular who was a really difficult adversary, Antonin Scalia. She welcomed Scalia on the court at first. He joined, and she went on in 1981, he came in 1986, and the court was getting kind of old and losing energy. And Scalia had tremendous energy and tremendous intelligence, and she welcomed that. But Scalia suffered from the syndrome which all the school kids will especially know, smartest kid. He had to be the smartest kid in the class. The class in this case was the conference room of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he was condescending to the other justices. He would send them so-called ninograms, correcting them on their grammar and their law, and that was annoying to them. One reason why Scalia didn't have as much power as Justice O'Connor was because he irritated his colleagues, including her. In fact, we asked Justice Stevens, "Do you think that Justice O'Connor moved to the left during her time on the court?" And Justice Stevens said, "Yes, I do." And we said, "Really? Why?" And his two-word answer was Justice Scalia. But that was a joke, because Justice O'Connor never complained about Scalia. It was very important. He would write he once wrote about one of her abortion opinions. In his own opinion, Justice O'Connor's opinion cannot be taken seriously. That's a pretty harsh thing to write about your fellow justice. But when her clerks would get upset, every Supreme Court justice has 4 law clerks, and they often draft the opinions. Her clerks would draft these zingers to shoot back at Justice Scalia. She always took them out. And when the clerks wanted to gossip and badmouth Scalia, she hushed them. Interestingly, this is one of the keys to her power in Washington. She did not gossip. That's hard to do in Washington. She went out, she was very social, she went out a lot, and gossip is kind of the coin of the realm in Washington when you're going out to dinner. And she never did gossip because she knew it would hurt her and it would hurt others. She was very self-disciplined that way. And when her clerks started gossiping, she said, "Stop it." And she never let Scalia get to her, except that they once played tennis together. And actually, John O'Connor, her husband, arranged the game because he was worried about them getting along as a doubles game. And she spent the entire time drilling Scalia at net. She was a better tennis player than he was. And when he was done, he turned to his partner and said, "We're never doing that again." She got along well with, she had interesting ways of dealing with justices. Justice Souter was a pal of hers, and she was always trying to set up Souter with a date. And she wanted to marry him off. She called up her friend Linda Webster, who was the wife of Judge Webster, the former head of the CIA, head of the FBI. And she announced that she was bringing Justice Souter to dinner because she wanted him to see a happily married couple. So Linda Webster turned to Judge Webster and said, "Okay, act happy." Souter, she did set up Souter with one date, who called Justice O'Connor the next day and said, "Well, it went okay, I guess." He said he had a good time and that we should do it again next year. She had a way of reaching out to people on her own terms. The most interesting story on this I heard was from Justice Clarence Thomas. He told me this story. That you recall at his confirmation hearing, it was very rough. Anita Hill's charges against him, Those are tough hearings. And so he came on the court, and Justice Thomas said to me, I felt hammered, that was his word, hammered, and lonely. And so I was walking back to my chambers after the first court conference alone, and she walked with me. And she said to me, those hearings were very damaging. And he thought to himself, yeah, I mean, yes, damaging to me personally, damaging to the court. He didn't know what to say. And she didn't say anything either. But the next day she walked with him again. And the day after that, and the day after that. And she started saying, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And finally she said, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And he said, oh, yes, ma'am. Okay. And he went, and he said it changed everything for him. Because he'd been sulking. He'd been alone. And by coming to lunch with the other justices, and by then, I mentioned earlier in my talk that only 4 justices showed up at her first lunch. By the early 90s, she had all the justices coming to lunch. Justice Sotomayor said that she learned when she got there that Justice O'Connor would come to the chamber. If the justice had not showed up for lunch, she would go to the chambers and make them come. She believed that breaking bread was important. And even though they did not, or maybe especially because they did not discuss cases at lunch, it was a chance for them to get along. So Clarence Thomas started to come to lunch. And he said it changed everything. He said that, you know, the court was not so collegial before she got there. And it wasn't so collegial after she left. But particularly in the 1990s, it was collegial, and that she had done that. Justice Thomas said to me, she was the glue. She was what kept this place civil. She had an interesting approach to her jurisprudence. She was not doctrinal. The law reviews don't love her. She didn't have legal theories that either she espoused or even particularly followed. She was extremely pragmatic. I suppose she was in the, legal scholars would say that she was in the tradition of Oliver Wendell Holmes, that the life of the law is experience, not logic. But she never quoted Justice Holmes or talked about learned hand or any of that. She was just a pragmatic person. And she cared about the practical impact of the court's decisions on regular people. Not all justices do that, but she did. She'd been in the legislature. She was actually the last Supreme Court justice to be elected to an office. So she was very mindful of that, sometimes to the frustration of the legal scholars. But to her, she was being practical. And this gave her a lot of power because she was in the middle. So on the 2 big social issues facing the court, affirmative action and abortion, she basically made the law for 25 years. Again, when she first came on the court, Justice Blackmun, who had written Roe v. Wade, thought, oh my God, she's a Reagan appointee, she's going to get rid of abortion, she's going to vote against it. She did initially, but over time, she evolved this middle-of-the-road view of saying that states could impose some restrictions on abortion, but not ones that unduly burdened a woman's right to have an abortion. A kind of middle-of-the-road view, not popular with everybody, but probably reflected the country, where basically 1/3 of Americans are against abortion no matter what, and about 1/3 of Americans are for abortion no matter what, and about 1/3 are somewhere in the middle under some circumstances. That's about where Justice O'Connor was, and because she was the 5th vote in several cases, that's where the Supreme Court has been for the last 25 years. That may change, but she made the law of the land. Same with affirmative action. She did not like racial preference. She did not like identity politics. She was uncomfortable with it. But, and she, in some cases, she was the 5th vote against set-asides. She did against state set-asides, against federal set-asides, of that form of affirmative action. But to show her practical mindedness on higher education, in 2002, the challenge was to the University of Michigan and Michigan Law School whether they could use racial preference. And she knew she was going to be the 5th vote, and she got into the briefs, and her clerks told us this. A couple of things. One is, in the state of California, they had a referendum on affirmative action and did away with it. And right away at UCLA and Berkeley, the two premier law schools, the number of African Americans went down below 1%. And she said, you know, law schools are training grounds for leaders. I believe 1 out of 4 U.S. senators is a lawyer. And she said, we just can't have that. We cannot have law schools that just have basically, top law schools that basically have no African Americans. She was also very influenced by a brief file by former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The military uses affirmative action a lot because you cannot have an officer corps that doesn't look like America. Those practical arguments influenced her, and she was the 5th vote to preserve affirmative action. Not comfortable with it, but she did it. She also saw that it's a long-term process. A lot of people think of the Supreme Court as the final word, the final court, the last word. That's not the way she saw it. She saw the Supreme Court as a branch of government in conversation with the other branches, so that she often would kick a case back down to the lower courts or back to the legislature, so that on the big, tough social issues, the law would slowly evolve. She was very big on change, yes, but incremental change. And it gave her a lot of power. She was interesting to clerk for. You know, a Supreme Court clerk, they have all been editor of the Harvard Law Review and editor of the Yale Law Journal and all that, and they have pretty big egos when they arrive. They are used to adults telling them how great they are. Not her. She's from a ranch. She was spare with the praise. So after a while, her clerks took a Xerox of her hand, put it up on the wall underneath a sign that said, if you want a pat on the back, lean here. She was in on the joke. She once took a clerk and leaned him up against the wall. She believed that her clerk should be fit. So she started an exercise class, aerobics class at 8 a.m. For the women clerks. The men were cut out, but they were supposed to be fit too. And one of them told us that he was eating an ice cream cone, and she came around the corner and he put the ice cream cone in his drawer. She wanted the clerks, although she wanted them to work very hard, she wanted them to have full lives. And one of them said, you know, she was a model for us, particularly for the women. She always hired 2 women clerks. There are 4 clerks. She always hired 2 women, more than anybody else. And she wanted to model a life for them that not only included hard work and success, she cared about success, but also taking care of your family. She had 3 sons and a great marriage, and going to cultural events. She would have loved this. She loved civic events. She loved going out in the evening. She loved giving good dinner parties. She would say to her clerks, you know, give good dinner parties. There was a sort of frenetic quality to this. One of her clerks said she would go on these outings. She'd take her clerks on down to the tidal basin to see the cherry blossoms, even if it was sleeting outside. She would go to the Arboretum, and one of them said to us, this was not stopping to smell the roses. It was speeding up to smell the roses and learning how to be a better rose smeller. She also modeled resilience. She got cancer. She got breast cancer. And at first, it really scared her. And she thought she was going to die. And for one day, she actually gave up. We know this from her husband's diary. Very atypical of her. But she did for about a day, and then she recovered. And when she recovered, she never missed an oral argument. She was on the dance floor within 2 weeks. She got herself a wig, and she just went out there and did it. And that was very much her attitude. Just do it. She didn't do this alone. She had a great marriage. Her marriage was a love story. And her husband was a very successful lawyer in Phoenix. He was the big man in Phoenix. He was head of the Rotary and head of a couple of hospitals, very civic-minded, managing partner of his law firm. Of course, he had to move to Washington with her. Not so successful. His law firm didn't work out. He had to leave and go to another one. And she knew this was tough on his ego. So one way she dealt with it was by going out a lot. She had to read 1,000 pages a day. Fortunately, she was a speed reader, because she went out she was the most social justice ever. I know that's a low bar, but they went out dancing and all the time. And she did it for him. At dinner, she would be quiet. She would let him tell the stories. He was a great storyteller and joke teller. And she knew that was good for his ego, and it was. Now, unfortunately, John got Alzheimer's. Got dementia, slowly, but then more seriously. And she decided, and if she took care of him as long as she could, she would bring him to her chambers. He would sleep on the bench in the front office, but finally she had to resign. And she said, she was explicit about it, I have to leave the court to take care of him. He sacrificed for me, and now I'm going to sacrifice for him. But the tragedy is that within 6 months of leaving the court, he couldn't really recognize her. And he formed what they call a mistaken attachment with another woman there, another Alzheimer's patient. And she would come in, and of course it broke her heart. Of course it did. She said publicly, I'm happy, he was depressed, now he's happy, but this is her husband of decades. But when she came into the nursing home, to the assisted care facility, she would find him holding hands with the other woman, whose name was Kay. She would sit down and hold his other hand. That was her deal with it. She herself got Alzheimer's, as you may know, well, actually the diagnosis is dementia, probably Alzheimer's, because she got it, fortunately, not till her 80s, but it came for her. But not before she'd had a whole second career after the Supreme Court, setting up something called iCivics. She believed that kids don't know anything about civics today. She has joked that they know more about the Three Stooges than the three branches of government. And so she wanted to improve civics education, and although she couldn't even do her own email, she set up a nonprofit that does video games for middle schoolers on how a bill passes Congress and how the Constitution works. It's now seen by 6 million kids a year. It's been very successful. She said, interestingly, that was her proudest achievement. Her friends said, come on, really? I mean, not the Supreme Court? But she meant it, because she reached all those kids. She believed her real religion. She was religious. She was religious. On that ranch, they would look up into the stars. And she went to church in Washington, but I think her real religion was a kind of civic religion, a faith in civic life and in civility. She went all over the world preaching it. She went to most traveled justice in history, too. She went to every state in the Union, giving speeches about civic obligation and civic duty and the importance of civility. She once summoned the majority leaders of the Senate and the House to her chambers to lecture them on civility, very unusual. She believed in it. And interestingly, her very last public statement ever was when Merrick Garland was nominated to the court. And the House, she's a Republican. The Senate Republicans were holding up his nomination so that they could nominate a conservative if a conservative won. She said, oh, come on, get on with it. Don't do that. She cared about her institutions. She was impatient to do the right thing. How lucky we were that she was the first. Thank you. Happy to take some questions after I put on my glasses here. Yeah. And she had a terrific teacher who was a rare thing in the late 1940s. He was not a sexist. He believed that women had a place too. And he had a kind of, what adults thought was kind of a corny, but was a very sentimental view of the importance of public life, the importance of going into public life, of not just hiding in private, but serving your country and serving your state. That had a huge impact on her, and for the rest of her life. So, as I'm sure for all of us, a great teacher can make a difference. This guy's name was Harry Rathbun, and they have an award. She gave the first Harry Rathbun Award at Stanford to this great teacher. So he made a huge difference. Her dad and her mother, sure, for sure, but he had a great teacher. Yeah. O'Connor and Ginsburg were pals. O.C. and I interviewed Justice Ginsburg a couple of times. And O'Connor was there for 12 years before Ginsburg arrived. So she was really glad to see another woman, partly because they finally built a ladies' room next to the conference room, but also just to have an ally. And they were allies. For instance, in Ginsburg's first year, the case came up testing single-sex education, the Virginia Military Institute. Big case, and it was assigned by the senior justice to Justice O'Connor. And Justice O'Connor said, no, Ruth should have this case, because Ruth Ginsburg had devoted her career as an activist to women's rights. Very unusual for a Supreme Court justice to be assigned a case and say, no, somebody else take it. And Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg said how much she really appreciated that. And when the opinion was handed down, they looked at each other. Justice Ginsburg cited an earlier O'Connor case as the controlling precedent. They looked at each other on the bench. I mean, there was a meaningful relationship. On the other hand, Justice O'Connor is a ranch girl, Justice Ginsburg was a city girl. They were not cozy. Justice Ginsburg told us she never came to Justice Ginsburg's chambers to talk about a case. She also told us a story. Justice O'Connor learned how to drive a tractor at the age of 10 and shoot a rifle at the age of 10. Justice Ginsburg never learned how to drive a car very well because she's a city girl. She said she flunked her driver's test 5 times. So Justice O'Connor's messenger, Romeo Cruz, said, Justice Ginsburg rear-ended Justice O'Connor's car twice in the garage. The first time he said was a hit and run. So O.C. and I asked Justice Ginsburg, we waited. This is the last question we asked. Is it really true that you rammed into Justice O'Connor's car? And Justice Ginsburg said, oh, yes, it's true. She said, I've never driven again. She explained that she ran into Justice O'Connor's car because she was trying to avoid running into Justice Scalia's car. Anybody else? Yes, this was a troublesome story. It was. The best I can think about it, I once read a biography of Theodore Roosevelt, who was not unlike Justice O'Connor. And Theodore Roosevelt, as you may remember, his wife and his mother died on the same night. His wife in childbirth and his mom, I believe, of typhus. And Teddy Roosevelt responded to that by going west, by leaving town, leaving actually his daughter, his infant daughter, who had been born that night, and to start a ranch. And I'm going to botch this quote, but Teddy Roosevelt said that black care cannot ride on a horse whose pace is fast enough. Keep moving. And that's the way Justice O'Connor was. She used to travel. She went manically traveling. After John went into the home, she traveled all the time, I think to avoid going there, really, partly because she just couldn't bear it. He didn't recognize her, and she had to keep moving. And her staff kind of went nuts. They said, you're going to make yourself sick. You're traveling too much. She had, like Teddy Roosevelt, she had to keep moving. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you always have to ask yourself. I am a 68-year-old old white male chauvinist, so I'm sure I have all sorts of biases, and I think it's probably true. But I wrote this book very closely with my wife, sitting over here, who we met in law school. O.C. and I met in law school. She actually became a lawyer. She's a real lawyer. I never practiced law. I never even took a bar, and O.C. really read the cases. But more to the important point, I think that O.C. really could see things in Justice O'Connor that I couldn't. Now, naturally, we were interested in her love life, and actually, I've written books about a lot of men. I was interested in their love lives, too. I was looking for their love letters, too. So this was not a gender bias thing, but it's a fair question. It is a fair question, and you have to kind of ask yourself, am I looking at this differently because I'm male and she's female? Just physical descriptions, clothes they wear. We thought about this a little bit. In fact, when I was writing the first chapter of the book, I had this little scene where she kind of went on, where I was going on about what she wore. And I don't remember if it was Osier, but somebody said to me, you know, maybe not, because we wouldn't be doing that about a man. You know, this is a tricky area, because you want to. I want to know everything about everybody I write about, but there are some interesting questions, and you have to ask yourself what your own biases are, what your own prejudices, your own feelings are, and you can't eliminate them, but you can try to be aware of them. So it's a fair question. Yeah, she was a Republican, but she was more than a Republican. She was a bridge builder, literally. I mean, she carried in her pocketbook a poem about a bridge builder, about a pilgrim who came along to a wide canyon, and the pilgrim built a bridge so that others may cross. He himself did not cross it. She was that way herself. She, as the first woman, she knew she had to be a traditional woman because men were scared of women and would be offended if she was too much of an activist and kind of too wild-eyed. So she always was careful to wear skirts and be very kind of feminine. But she was building a bridge so that other women could cross it. She cared about that more than ideology, by far. And yes, she was a Republican politician. She ran for office as a Republican. So she would hate what's going on now. No, I mean, she does hate it. She was all about civility, about people being reasonable, about talking to each other, and not about, I think what would offend her maybe the most is all the moralizing that goes on. I think it's called virtue signaling, where people on TV are always, the implication or the statement is, I'm more moral than you. You are less moral than me. She would hate that, because although she was a pretty moral person herself, she really was, she knew that you got nowhere by moral condescension. If you want to make things worse, you know, act morally superior to somebody, whether you are or not. She was much more in the school of, let's talk about this, let's figure, is there a middle road here? And she devoted her whole life. She didn't just talk about that. She did that, as I mentioned. You know, she participated in 2,000 cases in the Supreme Court. She wrote 600 opinions. She was the fifth vote 330 times. And then she came out and started iCivics. Her whole life was devoted to this. Yeah. What principles allowed O'Connor to rule across party lines? She had a faith in government, that government has to function, that we have to get along with each other. Even though, yes, argument's good, it's healthy. Our whole system is built on checks and balances, and it's built on people arguing with each other, but it has to get to a result. And at the end of the day, you have to compromise. I mentioned the Equal Rights Amendment. She would have preferred if the Arizona legislature passed the Equal Rights Amendment, but she knew that that was not going to happen. There were too many conservatives, so she did something else that she could do. She did something else that she could do. She passed local laws. She did not make the best be the enemy of the better. And that allowed her to get a lot done. Now, that's not to say she didn't have Republican views. She did. She was a kind of a moderate conservative most of her life. She did move a little bit to the left. So those things mattered to her, but what mattered more was getting things done for the people, for their government, for your community, and not just having stupid fights. Yeah, that's a good question, because we think of Reagan. The question was, why did Reagan appoint her as the first woman justice? This is sort of our system at work. The initial impetus, the reason why Reagan initially said that he would appoint a woman justice was politics. It was October 1980, and Reagan was behind women, the gender gap, by 10 points in the state of Illinois, a swing state. And a political aide said to him, hey, we got to do something to get the women vote, so let's promise to appoint a women justice. His own staff didn't believe him. He was serious about it. O.C. and I know from talking to the staff of the Attorney General, William French Smith's staff, that they thought that Reagan would appoint a conservative male, Bob Bork, to help push back the war. Remember, the Warren Court was quite liberal. And when Reagan was elected, the thought was that the Republicans would push back the excesses of the Warren Court. That's what the Attorney General's office thought they would do. But no, the word came back from the President of the United States. He's serious. He wanted to appoint a woman. His chief of staff, Jim Baker, told us you can be sure that Nancy Reagan had something to do with that. Whatever the reason, he was serious. And the only problem then was that there weren't that many women to choose from because the law was a male preserve. And those, hard to imagine today when half the law students today are women. Back in 1980, not so long ago, of 600 federal judges, only 8 were women. And they were all liberal Democrats. She was a state intermediate court judge. She wasn't even a federal judge. She wasn't even a state Supreme Court judge. But she was smart as hell. She was a fast study. She mastered the Constitution and federal law very quickly. Can you imagine how demanding it was for a state intermediate court judge to go into the U.S. Supreme Court, first woman ever, sit there with those males who were all judging her? She used to tell her law clerks, it's good to be first, but you don't want to be last. Yeah. Well, she was certainly an instrument of change. The very fact that a woman was appointed and succeeded actually brilliantly, was a force for change. And all over America, young girls in classrooms, and we interviewed some of them, were saying, you know, maybe I could be a judge. Maybe I could be a Supreme Court justice. Some of our law clerks who were in 5th grade or 6th grade were telling themselves that. And so she was a role model for sure. Beyond that, she changed the law. Although she was a conservative, and she believed in states' rights, and she was a little bit against the federal government being too intrusive in the states, when women and children were implicated, she moved to the left. I mean, for instance, this is a typical Sandra Day O'Connor case. A soccer mom was pulled over by a cop because I think her blinker didn't work. And they had a little spat, and the cop put the mom in jail. And the issue before the Supreme Court was, is it unconstitutional to be jailed for can you jail somebody for a misdemeanor? And the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Souter, writing the opinion, said, actually, there's nothing in the Supreme Court that says you can't be jailed for a misdemeanor. So yeah, the cop has the power to do that. She was in the minority saying no. Why? Because she got into the record of the case, and she saw that the cop had humiliated the woman in front of her children. And the children had really been terrified by it when mom was carted off. And she also saw the potential for racial profiling, that if a cop could pull somebody off to the side of the road and throw them in jail for a misdemeanor, who's most likely to be the victim? Actually, not women, African Americans were. And so, although she was not a big civil rights crusader, she had this kind of human sensitivity, and she was right on that case. She was in the minority, but she was right on that case. Anybody else? Yes. How did she balance being this powerful woman doing all this stuff and being a mom? It was tough. The joke, or the line about her at the state legislature was there, with Sandy, her nickname, there's no Miller time. You know, she never relaxed and had a beer on the couch. She just, part of it was just sheer hard work. But also part of it was knowing when to stop. She would be in the legislature and they'd be arguing about some bill later, and then she said, I'm going home. I got to make lunch for my kids, or I got to pack for camp, and she'd just leave. And her kids, she had 3 boys, they said had a light rain. Mom, there were 3 rules in the house. One was be home by 6. The second rule was do not speak ill of others. Good rule. And the third rule was don't hit your little brother. And so her sons had a lot of freedom, but they loved her and they listened to her. And when she had to crack the boom, she did. You can do it. It's hard. She'd be the first to say it's not easy, and she would talk to her clerks about this. But it can be done if you pay attention and you cut out the little stuff, and you don't get caught up in stupid little stuff. You keep your eye on what's important, what really matters. love being number one, but just, don't get caught up in petty feuds. And that she got a lot done because she didn't get caught up in petty stuff. Did her children follow in her footsteps? Yes, in the sense that they are good people, that they're civic-minded, that they serve their community. No, they did not become lawyers. One is in commercial real estate, one is in tech, and I'm not sure what the third one. The third one, the middle one, became a mountain climber. He climbed the 7 highest peaks in 7 continents. He dove to the Titanic. He climbed Mount Everest. Justice Ginsburg said she only saw Justice O'Connor look scared or anxious once. It was when there was a knock on the door of the Supreme Court conference room, and it was her secretary asking her to come to the phone to talk to her son who had just climbed Mount Everest. We're done. Thank you very much.